he found himself an enemy alien. He volunteered for the Army and received his American citizenship in 1943 at Fort Lee, Virginia. While with the 310th Infantry Regiment in 1944, he was transferred to the Office of Strategic Services, which preceded today's Central Intelligence Agency. He remained with the CIA for 34 years, rising to GS-18 and Senior Executive Level 4, protocol equal to a 3-star general. He was CIA Chief of Station in Austria, Argentina, Vietnam, Mexico, and Germany. He also served in senior positions in the CIG headquarters. He was awarded the Distinguished Intelligence Medal twice, the CIA's Intelligence Star, and the State Department's Award for Valor. After retiring, he was a consultant to Defense Intelligence Agency and to the Counterterrorism Task Force of then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1987, he was appointed Intelligence and Foreign Policy Analyst for the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Iran-Contra. He also worked for private enterprise in Europe and in Latin America, including kidnap recoveries in Colombia and Ecuador. Tom lectured on intelligence at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, at Tufts University, Georgetown University, UCF, and Rollins. He wrote articles in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Miami Herald, the Orlando Sentinel, and other publications, and for German newspapers. He worked on documentaries with the BBC, ABC, Nightline, CBS Television, CNN, C-SPAN, and German TV, and most recently with French and Japanese TV. We're very honored to have such a distinguished member of the University Club. Please help me welcome Tom Polgar.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this nice introduction. And if I do not speak sufficiently loudly, please call out and raise your hand. Anyway, make it known that you can't hear me. My wife always criticizes me for speaking too softly, except at home. Before I start my talk, I call your attention to the billboard here on my left. The pictures are too small for you to see what's on it, but perhaps after the talk you would care to give it a look. It shows some of the remains of the events that I talk about today. In the Garden of Beasts, Erik Larson presents a fact-based narrative that reads like fiction. It is about duty, love, innocence, and terror in the lives of the newly appointed American ambassador and his family in Hitler's Germany in 1933. Professor William Dodd, the 64-year-old head of the History Department of the University of Chicago, wanted to become an ambassador. He seemed well qualified. He had foreign affairs experience in the Wilson administration. He was past president of the American Historical Society, an authority on the history of the American South, owner of a farm in Virginia. He had a master's from Virginia Polytechnic and a PhD from the University of Leipzig in Germany. Dodd wrote a book in German about the life of Thomas Jefferson. When President Roosevelt offered him the job, nobody questioned Dodd's suitability. No hearings were held on the nomination, and the Senate confirmed him unanimously the day he was nominated. Couldn't happen today. Berlin was among the most important embassies, but it was no plum like Paris or London. There was no embassy office or residence. The old palace, which used to house them both, next to the Brandenburg Gate, burned down and was not reconstructed. The State Department's budget was cut during the Depression, but the diplomatic service, and remember, we got two things in Washington. We have the State Department, which is a big bureaucratic structure, and then the Foreign Service, which is a very elite organization, quite comparable, say, to Alumni Association of West Point or Annapolis. The diplomatic service remained a pretty good club of Ivy League gentlemen with independent incomes. Hitler's Germany was not the place they wanted to go. William Shirer, Columbia Broadcasting star reporter, author of the Berlin Diary, reported from Berlin in 1933. In the throes of severe depression, I missed the Berlin of the Weimar Republic, the carefree, emancipated, civilized air. My wife tried to cheer me up by taking me to the zoo. It was a lovely warm day. After watching the monkeys and elephants, we lunched on the shaded terrace. That zoo and the shaded terrace was part of the Garden of Beasts, the title of Larsen's book. Then Shirer continued. He called on the new American ambassador, Professor Dodd, a blunt, honest, liberal man. Now, liberal in those days meant something different from what it means today. I would say that Professor Dodd was a moderate conservative, a Southern Democrat. Dodd was not President Roosevelt's first choice. The president would have preferred an experienced political figure with an independent income, but several candidates declined. The prospect of dealing with Hitler and an upcoming winter in Berlin just wasn't attractive to people who lived well in the United States. President Roosevelt had lunch with his new ambassador. They shared outdated knowledge of Germany. The country they recalled was the friendly, cheerful, romantic Germany of their youth. They had not yet digested that Hitler's Germany was different, that its new, aggressive rulers had no respect for conventions, human rights, or traditional law. The president wanted Dodd to persuade Germany to pay the interest due on American bonds. Yes, the American bankers had made exorbitant profits lending to Germany, but the president said, our people are entitled to repayment. Then there was the Jewish problem. Roosevelt was appalled by the Nazi treatment of Jews, but understood the political aspects of the American government's condemning Nazi persecution. The president did not want to spark any comparison between Nazi treatment of Jews and American treatment of Negroes. Remember, we are back in the early 30s. Segregation is still the law of the land. Also, the president was conscious that a lot of Americans had German roots. Germany was our most important trading partner, and there were pro-German, even pro-Nazi sentiments in the electorate. American political discussion had framed the problem of German Jews as an immigration issue, unpopular then as it is unpopular now. The Nazis were pushing out Jews as America was reeling from the Depression and unemployment. It was easy to argue that German handling of Jews was a domestic affair, just like American handling of Negroes, and that foreign countries had no business in intervening in other sovereign countries' internal affairs. Immigration law governed the admission of all aliens. Consular officials were instructed to stick to regulations. Those possibly becoming a public charge were to be excluded. Immigration laws also required that visa applicants submit a police affidavit attesting to their good character. This was difficult for Jews wanting to leave Germany. It was unfortunate that American law created unforeseen obstacles for German Jews. That was the position of the State Department. But the practical result, the German quota of 26,000 per year was never filled. With unemployment high in the United States, no one called for more immigration. The Germans are treating the Jews shamefully, the president said, but that is not our affair. We must, however, help American citizens who happen to become victims. Dodd advised the president that he expected to live within his salary of $17,500 a year. I calculated that sum in today's, in then purchasing value compared to today. We are talking about roughly $300,000 plus. But out of that, the ambassador was expected to pay his expenses and his representational costs. Representational costs are the cost of maintaining his residence, giving receptions, having himself and his family suitably clothed, and so forth. To give you a comparison, you could buy a Buick tax-free delivered in Germany for $1,300. So $17,500 was a lot of money. He even hoped to save some money, Ambassador Dodd told the president. Dodd condemned the lavish entertainment at embassies, and there was room for condemning that. The Belgian ambassador spent more on a single party than the American ambassador's yearly salary. You are quite right, Roosevelt replied. Aside from 2 or 3 general dinners and entertainments, you need not indulge in any expensive social affairs. Neither Roosevelt nor the ambassador knew what they were talking about. On July 5, 1933, the Dodd family, the ambassador, Mrs. Dodd, son Bill, 28, a teacher, and 25-year-old newly divorced daughter Martha embarked for Hamburg. On the ship, waiting for departure, they met with Mrs. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was on board to say goodbye to Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. He got a trip to Europe as a present on his high school graduation. The tall, handsome boy became Martha's steady companion during the trip. Even so, Martha cried a lot while on the ocean. She gave little thought to life in Hitler's Berlin, but regretted leaving her pleasant and productive years in Chicago. By age 25, she was the published author of short stories. She was assistant editor and book reviewer for the Chicago Tribune, and that and her father's position gave her a very active social life, including friendship with writers like Thornton Wilder, Carl Sandburg, and Thomas Wolfe, who were not the only men in her life. She had a brief marriage with and friendly divorce from a millionaire New York banker. Martha liked men, and she liked sex. Her husband wrote, "What fun it was in the swimming pool, and how cute you were with me after I had taken off my bathing suit." Arriving in Hamburg on July 30, 1933, Dodd assumed that arrangements were made for the family's travel to Berlin. Not so. Advised that the Dodds intended to drive to Berlin, the embassy did not ask for the private railroad car, a normal courtesy of German railroads for arriving ambassadors. A misunderstanding. Yes, the Dodds wanted to drive to Berlin in their 4-year-old Chevrolet, but they failed to fill out the necessary paperwork to get the car off the ship. The prestige train to Berlin, the Flying Hamburger, required advance reservations. not made. So the Dodds traveled in 2 compartments on a slow train. To make a bad day worse, still on the ship, Dodd talked with reporters. One of them next day headlining that Dodd's primary mission was to prevent the persecution of Jews. That was the kind of distortion Dodd had hoped to avoid. Helping Jews was not part of his mission. According to daughter Martha, her father was mildly pro-German and I quote, "we did not particularly like Jews anyway," end quote. Ambassador Dodd was met by and immediately disliked the Counselor of Embassy, George Gordon, his second in command. He found Gordon stiff, arrogant, old-fashioned, overdressed, and condescending, living up to Dodd's view of career diplomats. On the train to Berlin, Gordon told Mr. Dodd that living in Berlin on his salary was simply not practical. It would prevent the required relations with the government. The ambassador would be dealing with very pushy, powerful people who respected only a show of strength. Dodd's approach to life as an ambassador would have to accommodate to that. Dodd accepted the logic, but it just was not in his personality to blow the trumpet. Unfortunately, concerns about his finances led to errors of judgment, which complicated his mission. Modesty and humility were never admired in Berlin, even before Hitler, or I may add since. It was a show-and-tell city long before Hitler. Show and tell. An embassy officer gave Martha a quick tour of central Berlin. This is July, full of color and energy. Martha was impressed. The impact of a large European capital in summer sunshine can be a form of seduction. That was Berlin's first impact on Martha. After dinner, the family went for a walk. No soldiers, no police, no restrictions. The night was soft and lovely, Martha wrote. Everything was peaceful, romantic, strange, and nostalgic. Martha fell in love with Berlin on her first night, misguiding her attitude toward the Hitler regime for many months to come. She remembered that first night. I quote, "our happiest in Germany. All of us were full of joy and peace," end quote. Exiting their hotel, the family entered the Tiergarten. This is the garden of beasts. Tiergarten literally means garden of animals. Now the zoo obviously is a garden of animals, but the author uses the phrase cleverly. Large animals, tigers, lions, boars, large rapacious mammals are known as beasts. The Nazis turned into the beasts of Berlin. So that's where the Garden of the Beasts comes from in this context. The Tiergarten in Berlin had the zoo, plenty of large animals, but much of the Tiergarten was more like Hyde Park or Regent's Park in London. It was a place of lakes, walks, riding paths, monuments, but also elegant residential housing, the embassies of Japan and of Italy, military headquarters, and top hotels. The embassy booked the Dodds into the imperial suite of the Esplanade Hotel, a magnificent hotel on the edge of the Tiergarten. Greta Garbo and Charles Chaplin stayed there, among others. It was also the customary temporary residence for newly arrived ambassadors of important countries. The Dodds gasped at the opulence of their suite. 8 rooms, 2 with walls of satin brocade, and 3 splendid baths. Mr. Dodd wrote that he wished to live inconspicuously and modestly in a small hotel, but the experienced American Consul General understood that the Germans had preconceptions on where the American ambassador should live. Mr. Dodd was worried about the expense of the 8-room suite. Martha was delighted. The ambassador's concern about money led to a very bad decision on the renting of a residence. Where else rent a residence? On Tiergarten Avenue. It was an impressive place, a 4-story mansion, like a small royal palace. It communicated power and prestige. The ambassador reported to President Roosevelt, "We have one of the best residences in Berlin at $150 a month. Due to the fact that the owner is a wealthy Jew, most willing to let us have it." That was the hitch. Banker Alfred Panofsky reserved for himself and his mother the 4th floor of the building, figuring that with the American ambassador in residence, his property and his person and that of his family were safe. Later, he built an apartment in the attic and moved in his wife and his children. The ambassador complained of bad fate, but the contract had no language on the use of the attic. A sign of innocence. Another sign of innocence. Mrs. Dodd was surprised that many residences were offered for her viewing at very low prices. Well, of course, all the rich people who felt themselves endangered by the Nazi regime wanted to rent their property to diplomats because they figured that would at least save the property. The Dodds' rented residence was suitable for entertainment at the highest level, with room for hundreds. Martha especially liked the library, with its large brown leather sofa. It soon became an asset in her romantic life, as her parents had a habit of retiring early. The sofa is mentioned in several memoirs. The Dodds' welcoming informality quickly created a social hub of politicians, journalists, artists, and spies. A safe haven where people could mingle and speak without fear. No rigid protocol, but a casual air of freedom. Prince Louis Ferdinand, the late emperor's grandson, described the house as his second home. At one point, the ambassador warned Prince Louis, saying, "You talk too freely." He says, "I will come to your funeral, but that will not help you." News reporters felt welcome and liked the ambassador's sense of humor, hospitality, and openness. He received very friendly media coverage. The residence issue settled, and a large domestic staff in place. The family was free to sightsee outside Berlin. The license plate of the ambassador was number 13. 2 digits in then Berlin, signifying a very important person. My license plate in Vienna was Vienna 006. It got salutes wherever the car went. When they stopped, people gathered with friendly but also Nazi greetings. The excitement of the people was contagious, Martha wrote. Quote, "I hired as vigorously as any Nazi," end quote. In a letter to Thornton Wilder, Martha got carried away. Quote, "Wholesome and beautiful, these young Germans. Good, sincere, healthy, mystic, brutal, fine, hopeful, and capable of death and love. Deep, rich, wondrous human beings, these youths of Hitler's Germany." The Dodds' early impression during that summer in Hitler's Germany were more favorable than the reporting of the international media and of the American embassy. The critical tone of reporting turned out to have been accurate, but in its time was viewed with skepticism in the State Department and in the American business community. They deemed the embassy too critical of Hitler's government. There was criticism from right-wing and isolationist circles that the consular reports exaggerated the beatings, persecutions, and street violence against Jews and opponents of the regime. But the embassy also reported correctly on the German economic revival, the quality of public transportation, the pomp and circumstance of the Hitler regime, and the assurances of government spokesmen that Germany wanted peace and economic progress. These pro-German sentiments were in line with the early impressions of the Dodd family. They sort of understood the Nazi regime's effort to reduce Jewish participation in public life. Ambassador Dodd was familiar with efforts to limit the number of Jews in Ivy League schools, and even at the University of Chicago. He was not surprised about such measures in Germany and took a somewhat benign approach on Nazi efforts to limit Jewish influence. But that was before his recognition of the full reach of Hitler's policies. The Dodds found their first summer in Berlin very pleasant, and they liked their location. To the horror of some traditional Foreign Service people, Dodd walked to work on foot alone. With President Hindenburg convalescing out of town, Dodd could not be formally accredited. That freed him from a lot of protocol obligations and gave the family time to travel. Soon enough, they encountered incidents of molestation and beatings, usually for failure to show proper respect to the flags of marching stormtroopers. One victim was a New York surgeon, Dr. Daniel Mulvihill. In the report of the Consul General, an American citizen of a fine type and not a Jew. Protection of American citizens was a consular responsibility. The number of reported incidents indicated that there was a problem of some magnitude, reflecting policy, not just individual transgressions. Some claim that Consul General George Messerschmitt exaggerated the significance of the issue. Messerschmitt himself was being accused of being Jewish. He was not. He subsequently went on to be ambassador in Austria, Argentina, Switzerland, and finished as an Undersecretary of State. One such skeptic of consular reporting was H.V. Kaltenborn, a star reporter of the Hearst chain. It was ironic that on their last day in Germany, the Kaltenborns were attacked by stormtroopers in the center of Berlin and had to be rescued by an American consul. Ambassador Dodd wrote in his diary that he managed to keep reports of such incidents out of newspapers, but he found them repugnant, utterly different from his experiences as a student in Germany. The importance of Germany, the size of the diplomatic community, and the willingness of key government officials to socialize, to produce endless rounds of parties and receptions. Except for Hitler, the German leadership attended diplomatic functions routinely. Goebbels, Goering, other top Nazi leaders routinely attended receptions of the foreign embassies. Ambassador Dodd felt most comfortable with Vice Chancellor Franz von Papen and with Finance Minister Hjalmar Schacht. Both, by the way, were acquitted at the Nuremberg war crime trials. But Dodd also appreciated the then 36-year-old propaganda Mr. Goebbels' sharp sense of humor. Martha became the belle of Berlin. She had tea with Hitler. He kissed her hand twice, but did not invite her again. She was a guest at Marshal Goering's sumptuous estate. She had well-reported affairs with Germany's most famous flyer, General Ernst Udet, and astonishingly with the head of the Gestapo, Dr. Rudolf Diels. Now, Diels was not the Gestapo man from the B movies you might have seen over the years. He was a handsome, married lawyer, a smooth, fluent English speaker, in charge of a large, efficient, and widely feared police service. On the other hand, he also became one of Ambassador Dodd's trusted informants, and the ambassador claimed in his diary that Diels has helped him on many occasions. That's not the picture you get of the Gestapo. Martha had a relationship with a French second secretary who became head of the French mission to the United Nations. But her most controversial affair was with Boris Vinogradov, second secretary of the Soviet embassy and a KGB officer. He drove a Ford convertible, often with the top down, just like Wilfred Madsen. But with his right arm around Martha's shoulder, resting on her breast. They had a love affair which Soviet intelligence wanted to exploit. I know of no evidence that Martha did anything for the KGB, but she ran in bad company and was convicted in New York for espionage. The case was ultimately dismissed, but she was also held in contempt by the House Un-American Committee. To evade possible jail time, Martha, with a very rich husband, fled to Mexico and then to Czechoslovakia, never returning to the United States. Her Russian lover, Vinogradov, was shot in Moscow in 1938 as one of the victims of Stalin's Great Purge. As repression and violence increased in Germany, Ambassador Dodd and other top ambassadors refused invitations to the Nuremberg Party Congress. You remember this was the big yearly outing of the Nazi Party, which Hitler used to proclaim radical new measures. The ambassador's absence irritated Hitler, who considered Dodd as an old fogey. Worse for Dodd was the reaction in the State Department. The pretty good club of the Foreign Service viewed Dodd's refusal to attend as needlessly provocative, harmful to his major task to make contacts with the government. Dodd, in turn, disregarded the State Department establishment, and this led to a sort of guerrilla warfare, diminishing Dodd's credibility in Washington. In June 1934, there were signs in Berlin of an approaching crisis. Dodd wrote in his diary, "The atmosphere grew more tense than at any time since I had been in Germany. Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels warned of dire consequences for opponents of the regime. The Italian ambassador's wife told Mr. Dodd, 'Something terrible is going to happen. I feel it in my bones.' What happened became known as the Night of the Long Knives. On June 30, the black uniformed security organization, the SS, with the personal participation of Hitler, Goering, and SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, launched the purge of the brown-shirted traditional stormtroopers. There were other more or less innocent victims, including former Chancellor General Kurt von Schleicher, his wife, his cabinet member General Ferdinand von Bredow, and the leaders of conservative Christian nationalists. Vice Chancellor Papen escaped, perhaps, because his daughter asked Ambassador Dodd to send an American embassy car to the Papen residence. The car was sent. Next day, Papen's oldest son came to the embassy to thank Ambassador Dodd for the family's survival. Exact numbers of victims were never announced. Hitler killed 77 were killed that day. Goering said he personally approved 75 execution orders. Gestapo leader Diels estimated there may have been up to 700 victims. Diels himself escaped because his former chief and brother-in-law, Hermann Goering, advised him to be especially careful, quote, during the next couple of days, which included the 30th of May. The Western European Division of the State Department minimized the violence. They noted that in all the trouble, no foreigners were molested. There was no cause for worry if the visitors minded their own business. Ambassador Dodd held the traditional 4th of July reception for some 300 guests. "So you are still alive," was a frequently heard greeting. With isolationism at home and appeasement in Europe, Ambassador Dodd felt his usefulness was coming to an end, but he wanted to stay on through Roosevelt's second term. The president gave him comforting words, but no help, as Dodd came under increasing pressure from the State Department. They called him Ambassador Dodd. He was humiliated when, in his absence, the official in charge of the embassy was directed to attend the Nuremberg party rallies. Dodd recommended against American participation at the Olympics in Berlin, but the United States sent the largest foreign delegation to what turned out to be Hitler's greatest peacetime triumph. Dodd's analysis of developments was on the mark, and he was under the impression that he retained the president's confidence. He was shocked when he received a telegram from the Secretary of State in November 1937. Quote, "Much as the President regrets any personal inconvenience which may be occasioned to you, he requests that you leave Berlin by December 15, if possible, but in any event not later than Christmas." There was a consensus in the State Department that Ambassador lost his usefulness, had no influence with the German government, and could no longer serve the interests of the United States in Berlin. Former Consul General Messerschmitt, by then Assistant Secretary of State, concluded that the ambassador suffered a gradual organic decline and that he was deeply depressed. Messerschmitt wrote, "I think he was so thoroughly appalled by what was happening in Germany and the dangers it had for the world that he was no longer capable of reasoned thought and judgment." Shortly after retirement, William Dodd died on his farm in Virginia. Hitler progressed from triumph to triumph, as predicted by Mr. Dodd. And then came the reversal with World War II. All the buildings mentioned in this book, were destroyed during the war. There is a monument on the edge of Tiergarten to the hotel in which Ambassador Dodd has stayed. And of course, everything that remained of Nazi buildings was leveled. The beasts remained in charge of the garden until they were killed by the Soviet army in 1945. And that completes my talk. I'll be happy to take questions.
Please wait for the microphone if you have a question.
We've all heard of SS, Gestapo, the stormtroopers and all that, but I had trouble when I was reading the book trying to differentiate and all the infighting between the different groups. What were they supposed to be doing? The Gestapo, the SS, and all of the different groups?
It started with the SA. They wore brown shirts, and they were the stormtroopers of the Nazi movement. During the Weimar Republic, it became an unfortunate practice in Germany that all political parties developed organizations capable of street fighting. And the SS, the SR, the brown-shirted stormtroopers, became the most important of the street fighting and demonstrating elements. The SS wore black uniforms, and they were formed originally to become Hitler's personal bodyguards. They were an elite organization, and their chief was Heinrich Himmler, and they gradually developed into the all-powerful security service of the Nazi regime. They considered themselves politically, socially, and power-wise more important than the brown-shirted stormtroopers. And then you had the regular army that was like the regular army everywhere, and the regular army feared that the brown-shirted stormtroopers would